So, thanks for having me. I'm here because I randomly ran into Magdalena at a SAM event, and she said, "Oh, I live in River Plantation." I said, "Oh, I've had some students work on some flood-related stuff on the San Jacinto that what's up there," and so I'll talk about some of that today and have a discussion a little bit after. Hopefully, if anybody has questions, you guys want to talk about some of the various issues. So, I'm a professor in the Environmental and Geosciences Department at Sam Houston. This work started right after Hurricane Harvey. I got funded on an internal grant. I wrote a National Science Foundation grant. They said, "These are great questions. These really need to be answered, and we're not giving you money." So I proceeded to work with undergraduate students that we already had at Sam Houston, and they helped do a lot of the kind of legwork for digitizing things in GIS and stuff like that. So my team of 4 students I was able to hire for a couple of years down there and get them some experience. Some of them work for City of Houston now and Texas 811 and stuff like that. So it's working.
Oh, it's not gonna work.
Did it turn off? Is there anything showing on the screen?
There is.
Can you do it?
Can you do it with that? There you
Okay.
go.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
watch
That's
him
good.
when he pushes the
Okay.
button. You
Okay.
push.
All right.
So I wasn't sure how familiar everybody was with just background and flooding. So when Mark asked me to cover things, he asked me if I could cover some of the research stuff and then also just some background on flooding and just why it's so bad in this area in general. I imagine with the civil engineer background, this isn't going to be new, but if you want to click through some of the things. So what I usually talk about when I give community talks on flooding.
I apologize.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I hear there was some dinner fiasco. So.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I believe it.
No, that's not what delayed me. I apologize. Go ahead.
Oh, I think it's working now. It's just delayed. So when I usually give community talks, whether it's in high schools or for things like this, we talk about some different factors, right? And just break it down to things like how hard did it rain, right? What's the intensity? How long did it rain? Storms like Harvey obviously aren't the same as storms that we've had recently that last an hour. In fact, my yard was really happy that it was raining like an hour, break. It wasn't all just running off into our drainage ditches and stuff like that. Infiltration rate, I'm going to get to this in a second, but Texas is somewhat unique. You probably hear my accent's not from Texas. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and so the soil's very different here than it is in Wisconsin in terms of looking at some of these different things. Land use, land cover, I'll get to some images that are the only things that usually elicit oohs and ahs from my students in terms of changes and what's happened in the area, which you all know better than I do from this area and how things are changed. The size of the stream channel, the San Jacinto is constantly changing like other rivers, right? How much can it hold? What's the capacity? There's all kinds of sand and gravel mining. There's lots of dredge projects after floods along the bridges where things back up and all these kinds of things. And then drainage projects within developments, right? I have a friend that's on the board up in Elkins Lake on the south side of Huntsville, and they had after one of their most recent storms, they had a lot of drainage issues just because of all the plastic garbage, for example, that backed up in some of those channels and things like that and caused flooding. It had nothing to do with the rivers themselves in those different areas. And then topography and slope, we live in a flat area relatively, right? And so it's different than other risk in different places when we talk about some of these things. So you guys probably already know some of this, right? But this is a NOAA image about what the 100-year precipitation is for a 24-hour storm, right? And we know that just naturally, even if we didn't live here, what's going on, right? So what's the pattern?
It's more in the south than it is anywhere else.
Yeah, why?
Because we're close to the water.
Yeah, right. It's a relatively easy question to answer if you're familiar with the area, right? Not all my students, when I go to different areas or things, even though they grew up in this area, know, right? So just conveying that, hey, where does rain come from? It comes from this hot body of water an hour and a half away, right? And so we have very different air here than we have in places like Wisconsin or different areas like that when we look at the risk for these different things. And then we get to this map like I was talking about with the soils in this area, right? It's very different. Like I said, you can pick out Wisconsin there in the upper part of the Midwest. It's very different than Texas, right? And what it's difficult here is it's somewhat continuous in certain parts of the state, but there's certain neighborhoods or areas where the clay lenses are definitely thicker than others. The clay texture makes up a greater percentage. So we're getting a bunch of rainfall from the Gulf. We have a bunch of clayey soil in certain areas. Even without people, we're going to get some runoff in this area, right? And then we're going to introduce the people part of it here in a minute and talk about what's going on with that. And so you just can't push the water through the clay. It's got really small openings, small pore spaces. And so it's not like sandy soil. So the watershed of San Jacinto's got some clay in it, and it's going to make for more runoff on top of everything else. Then we get to this part, which is kind of a famous graph they usually show in hydrology and things like this, and how land use, land cover change affects things, right? You get a storm, you're in Sam Houston National Forest, big deal, right? Not as big an issue, right? You're dropping the rainfall, the vegetation's intercepting it, it's soaking up. You drop it now in an area like Conroe, it's developed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. For a while, I was citing studies on Conroe that it was the fastest growing one of the top 10 fastest growing mid-sized cities in the world. If you looked at it in the world, we were on there at one point in 2016. It was like us, one other city in the United States, and like 8 cities in India, right? And so the growth rate is just incredible in terms of what we're seeing in these different areas. So you're getting more runoff upstream, right? I was actually looking at some of the new homes when I was driving in the highway. I had an accident on it, so I took the back lane, and I'm just watching the new homes and just kind of shaking my head like, here we go again. The growth is great for the economy. If you're a flood hydrologist or civil engineer, you're like, there's going to be a lot more runoff in these different areas. So this is actually the gauge in terms of the rating curve for Conroe right at I-45, right, for the San Jacinto. Obviously, USGS collects data. They've gotten better at collecting discharge data over time with ADCP and digital instruments and stuff to track discharge. And so this is what things look like from the last 5 years of data, just plotting the water surface elevation of the river relative to the discharge. And I'm going to get back to this in a minute in terms of how we use this to look at our flood study stuff and what's happening. But obviously a strong relationship. You get more runoff to the river, the water heights get higher. And you guys know that from right over in here, right? In terms of what you're seeing in this different area. So what I wanted to get at is something that I've been talking about around different places around the country at some conferences and my classes, high schools, communities when I'm invited, when y'all are nice enough to have me at these types of things. We have floodplain maps, right? How good are they? They're terrible. They're terrible, right? Especially in this area, right? If you look at floodplain maps on Montgomery County Floodplain Viewer, Walker County, Harris County, at least right now, a bunch of the maps still haven't been updated for people to look at since 2014 or 2017 when you look a lot of them. Now, there's supposed to be some new ones coming out this coming year, but we'll see. Federal government stuff always gets delayed. We'll see if it actually comes to pass or not. But I've been trying to emphasize that when we have big floods like Harvey, we still have these static floodplain maps, right? None of the recent storms, so Harvey, Imelda, and some of the other big events we've had since then, none of them have been incorporated into our floodplain maps, right? And so, especially people that aren't from the area or us in this room that are literally in the community watching it happen and knowing that the risk doesn't match the maps, what can we do to try to convey this risk more quickly without having to wait for all the bureaucracy of FEMA and counties and all the consulting that goes on? I mean, the gold standard is still hydrologic and hydraulic models, right? If you can couple those two together to get the most accurate data. But it takes time. There's not funding everywhere across the United States to do this after every big event shifts the curve. And we know we're expecting more water for each return period event, a 50-year flood, a 100-year flood. But we don't have the maps that reflect that, right, in these different areas. So when we talk about the probability, it's changing in all these areas, but people don't know that exactly, right? One thing we found in communicating with the public is there's not really a strong understanding of what a 100-year flood even is, right? You say 100-year flood, and people are like, oh, Harvey happened, we're good for another 99 years, right? That's not at all what it means, just a statistical or probability designation. There's some literature that shows, oh, we should communicate this as the 1% annual chance flood each year, and I'm thinking, that doesn't come out as clean on the news as just saying 100-year flood. Like, from a communication standpoint, having a phrase that's double the length isn't necessarily going to help, right? And so people are not understanding, especially with more moisture in the air from a warmer atmosphere, warmer Gulf and things like that, that these things can happen back-to-back years and things like that. So we look at the odds, right? The most common mortgage term in the United States is still 30 years, right? And so you just take a basic probability function, you say, okay, a 100-year flood, what are the odds of that happening over a 30-year mortgage? Well, about 26%. About 26%. That's great if your statistics are accurate and things stay that way, right? But what we're seeing in a bunch of river basins around the U.S. and Texas is your 100-year flood might actually be a 50-year flood when you equate that to the discharge. So what does that look like when you plug it into the probability function? Now you're up to almost a 50% chance of that same home flooding if the boundaries are changing. But the people that live in those homes do not know that exact statistical risk. They might know they flooded during Harvey, but they're not technically maybe even in a 100-year floodplain, so the bank doesn't require flood insurance and things like this, right? People that have their mortgages paid off don't have to have flood insurance if you don't want to, right? It's up to you at those points. So getting ready to get in the actual study part, right? There was this paper that came out about 16 years ago now where they said stationarity is dead. In other words, we know that the probabilities are changing, and then not much has changed in terms of what we're actually doing in the 16 years after that. The paper's been cited a couple thousand times. It's been picked up by more popular media, not just by scientists, and we are where we are, right, in terms of what we're looking at, okay? So things are outdated, the land use change, shifting precipitation, all these kinds of things we're talking about. So people just don't know the risk. So let's get into what the question was that we were working on answering with this. Some of you guys may recognize this. This is a picture from Harvey off of Rayford Road, a little bit south of here. Okay, but we want to know in an area like this where there's a lot of urbanization going on, what is happening to the changing flood discharges? How does that equate to flood stage? And then how do we translate that to additional flood exposure when we look at residential properties? Now, we did this with a snapshot in time. We looked at homes before and after Harvey, right? So I'm going to tell you right away that new buildings aren't in here because we wanted to make a direct comparison of just how Harvey would have affected already existing homes with the floodplain maps as is, right? So the risk is even worse than what I'm going to show you in terms of making that direct comparison and try not to bias it with just new homes being added, okay? I don't have to give a great description of this. You all know where we are. I'm not presenting this in Nevada today. But when we look at things, right, this is the land cover, right, leading into Hurricane Harvey, okay? I chose to look at this with my students because Houston's already so developed when you look at it, right? I mean, most of what's affecting the runoff is the expansion outside of Houston, right? Getting into areas where they're adding new highways like the Grand Parkway and things like that and expanding into these regions. That's where the risk is really increasing and pushing the water downstream into areas like that. So this is usually what gets oohs and ahs from my students. I don't expect it from you all, right? Because you've watched it happen over the years and things like that. But this is Conroe in the Woodlands just in an aerial image in the 1980s, right? 336 loop isn't even complete, right? Okay? And so when we look at it, I'm going to highlight some of the areas. Can you guys see the pointer? Oh, it's not showing up on the screen, so I'm close enough to point to it.
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. I mean, you guys down here in this area, and then the woodlands, things like that.
Ooh,
Ew, wow, hey, so excited. Yeah. And so, in addition to this already being a place where there's expected to be a lot of flooding, all of these impervious areas are going to make it worse than clay it already is and things like that to add the runoff. And all these areas upstream, especially of River Plantation and the communities getting down by 242 that are flooding, and then even on further downstream, right, are being impacted by this increasing risk. So we use the Army Corps of Engineers software, HEC SSP, to look at before and after in terms of flood discharge quantification and looking at what the 100-year discharge was expected to be before and after Harvey when we incorporate this into the record. And we get away from just the 2014 maps that were created. And we use the cross sections from FEMA's flood insurance study to look at how these were changing at each cross section, right? So we're looking at how the discharge is increasing and then looking at how the water level is changing when we look at this at each cross section by plugging them into the rating curves and then extrapolating upstream and downstream based on where we have gauge data to make our flood depth grids and things like that. And then lots of GIS work. So my students were most helpful at painstakingly digitizing all of the building footprints that weren't in Microsoft's artificially derived building footprints just from taking aerial imagery. And so most of them were in there, but my students had to go through and digitize footprints. And we digitized buildings that were mainly 700 square feet and up when we looked at kind of standardization of trying to capture most mobile homes and things that were larger than that and make sure we weren't getting too many things in there like storage sheds. If there were more than one thing per parcel, we went with the biggest property on that parcel to look at what was affected in that area with Montgomery County's assessor's data. So You can see there are changes after Harvey, increases in the 100-year discharge at all of these different locations, right? And so looking specifically along here, the changes might not look as great as some other areas. One, that's because we actually have better data on a big river like the West Fork this year. Just, I've pulled some gauge data and was shocked that some of these really developed areas in Montgomery County, there's like, at the time Harvey occurred, there's like 17 years of data. You can't really derive any accuracy in a floodplain map from collecting 17 years of data, right? Especially if that 17 years didn't include some of the worst events like Tax Day floods, Memorial Day floods, Harvey, Imelda, and these kinds of things. You're way underestimating in some of these regions, okay? But it's also really flat here, right? So even a small percent change could have profound effects depending on how that looks across the landscape. So these were the 3 gauges, right? The one just downstream of Lake Conroe, right at Conroe at 45, and then all the way down by Lake Houston, and then you're looking at the percent change in terms of the water surface elevation there now. When we took the discharge and then figured out how much bigger would a 100-year floodplain or a 100-year flood be just based on the statistics of just the last few years of data right after Hurricane Harvey, okay? And again, using that function that has a pretty strong statistical relationship to move the discharge to the height of the flood in these different systems. So this is just an example of the output in terms of the flood depth grid that we get in these different systems. It's no different than what you're looking at for different FEMA stuff and where they're actually just drawing the boundary from that, right, when they actually do this. But they don't have this data yet. So some of my colleagues are like, I live by Spring Creek. Can you give me a map for Spring Creek? Because I don't know what my risk is. And it's worse down there. Here, the maps might be off by 3 feet, looking at the difference in what a 100-year statistical flood is, right? Harvey was above that level, but just adding it in, it becomes part of the statistics. Spring Creek, with all the urbanization development and extra runoff they had, some of the maps are off by 6 or 7 feet in terms of the water surface elevation down there. So you're talking entire neighborhoods, right, that might be more wet than they were before, okay? So this should look familiar, right, based on zooming in on River Plantation and right around the interstate. You can see what things were based on the flood insurance study. This is what things were based on FEMA's study in 2014, okay? It's not going to look drastically different here, just updating the 100-year flood, but you are going to notice the water's getting deeper and expanding in some areas. Now, I'm only looking at the West Fork, right? There's other drainages that feed into the West Fork, but you have to have transects and cross-sections to do the studies on those. I don't have that data publicly for some of the smaller drainages and stuff, right? Okay, but you can kind of estimate how some of this might backflood based on what the water levels are that we're finding from some of these areas that do feed into the West Fork.
Ross, do you mind just back up one slide? Let's just look at that comparison again. So
Yeah.
in 4 years' time.
So this is the estimate, yeah, when you take the 2014 FEMA flood insurance study that was done, and these are the maps that are public in most areas.
Mm-hmm.
So ready? Okay. And so it's hard to tell some of the differences just looking at this. So what we want to quantify is, well, how does this translate to home values, right, and the actual properties that are exposed? This is what that looks like. So this is the damage by depth that you would expect by taking those building parcels and pushing them through that flood depth grid layer, right? Which was pretty good resolution. We were at 10-meter resolution for our flood depth grid, so it's pretty good relative to the size of buildings and their footprints. And then this is the number of homes that you'd expect 2014 based on the map that I just showed you. This is for the whole West Fork reach of the San Jacinto, not just for River Plantation, obviously, right? Way more homes than that when we look at the exposure. And then 2018, and then the change. So I've had this question before, well, why did that go down? Well, this went down because they jumped in another category, right? It's not because there's less overall risk. I mean, when you look at the overall numbers, right, we're pulling 143 more homes into the floodplain by updating these maps and looking at them. This is the total exposure, so I didn't run like depth damage functions to see, you know, if you get a certain depth of water, 60% of the house, right, value might be lost or something like that. This is just looking at the raw value of homes that are exposed and the increase. $23 million more of homes based on the assessed Montgomery County Assessor's District value in 2017. Okay.
So that's showing that in 2018, 97 houses had up to a foot of water.
Yep. 97 houses would be expected during a 100-year event. If you get the exact discharge of a 100-year flood, you'd have between no water and a foot of water. Somewhere between 0.01 feet and 0.99.
So again, this isn't factual, this is estimation.
this is what would happen if you updated the 100-year floodplain maps, right? If you just took the Harvey layer and looked at what flooded, that's different. And you can get that from USGS. You can get their estimated water depth from Hurricane Harvey and look at what actually happened from just that event. But in terms of updating FEMA's maps, they never take just the worst event and then release that to people as the new odds of what's going to happen to everybody, right? So that makes sense, hopefully. Okay. All right.
How much of a difference, what's a delta or from the lowest point to the highest point in the 100-year floodplain? How many feet of elevation does that include?
That's a good question. I mean, I haven't gone. That's a good question. I haven't gone in to see how much different it is, and it's hard to quantify. It depends on what you're going from. Like, are you going from the water surface elevation during a 100-year flood? Are you going from the standard river elevation during base flow? It depends. I mean, the water depth in some places gets to 30 to 40 feet if you're out there in the middle of the river or deeper, right? But onto the floodplain, I mean,
Did you-
20 feet, 15 feet.
Point of elevation.
Did you
of
actually
sea
come
level.
up with a new 100-year water surface elevation?
Yes, that's what we have. Yeah. So if I go back, let me go back for a minute. That's a good question too. So
Oh, okay.
that's the actual water
Okay,
surface
I missed that
elevation.
one, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I could draw. I could go back in the software and draw a transect through and figure out what the difference is in those different areas. That I just didn't do that.
Yeah, so essentially, that's the delta I think you're kind of alluding towards, Carl, is that like at Lake Conroe, there is a 5-foot difference between pre-2017 and post-2017 with the 100-year floodplain. Now, how that spreads out over the land is how fast or drastically the land's changing. So if you're in a relatively flat zone, 5 feet could extend for miles.
Yeah.
If you're in a relatively hilly zone, it could go 5 feet. I mean, it really depends.
But the question really is the flood zone go by elevation, or is it more than that?
It's technically like a static water surface elevation. So the 100-year being 163, meaning that if you took a flat line and drew it at 163 on a profile, and then you drew the natural topography of the ground, anywhere below 163 feet within a relative distance of the channel would be considered the 100-year.
Yeah. So that's what I should have explained that better. That's what this is. This is taking that water surface elevation from those cross sections and subtracting off the digital elevation model of the land surface.
Correct.
So when you see this on FEMA map, I'm showing you a pretty blue map. When you see this on the FEMA maps, it would all be one color, and then you just see the polygon for the 100-year boundary. Hopefully, that make more sense. Hopefully.
Yeah.
All right, so what do we see here? Well, got definitely more property exposure, right? At the time I made this about a month ago, they were estimating about $9 million worth of property. About 400 properties in Montgomery County were going through the buyout process. This was obviously a major thing after Hurricane Harvey, and then there were more volunteers right after that. Usually, the further you get out from the event, we call it the adaptation effect, right? And people kind of forget about different things, or you get new people in an area that didn't experience Harvey, right? So the best time to do buyouts, if people are going to volunteer for them, is right in that period right after. And Harris County had like 4,000 volunteers to be bought out, when the previous 20 years they had like 2,000 total. So just differences in there. More people are in application. People in the lowest lying areas along the river are in that process. The problem when we look at risk, though, is that there's a lot of people that might get a lot of water on their house that are volunteering for these buyouts, but it's essentially being offset by all the new homes that are being put in the 100-year floodplain, just as it exists in 2014, right, using the existing FEMA maps, not including what we're showing here with the changing dynamics in these different areas. And so, why is that? Well, not everybody knows the risk and the statistics. And then I like to point this out, since I'm coming in from Sam Houston, we're not necessarily the best ones to be preaching this to anybody. Now, I will say, I'm not on the building committee at my university, okay? And when you get land for cheap and you're looking to develop things, that comes into play, right, in terms of the economics. But you guys know, just up the road, right, this has changed things in the dynamic and the population, the roads and traffic down here, right? With the College of Osteopathic Medicine, they've built 2 new parking garages, or they built one, I think they're working on the second, and now they're putting in the health sciences building next to the College of Osteopathic Medicine.
And what's funny is, right down the road from you, the city of Conroe has refused to issue building permits, and they're making them tear their building down.
Right, yeah. No politics involved at all,
No.
which I won't get into, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but when we first heard this, my colleague who's a geologist, he used to work for Texas DOT, and he does a lot of stuff with clays and stabilization, and used to work on runways that they poured that were bumpy because they weren't stabilizing things. But right away he's into the building stuff too. Right away he looked at this and said, "Wait a minute, my boys were both in Boy Scouts. Why are we building our medical school in a place my boys used to go canoeing, right, for the old
That's
camp, right?" And then there's this quote that I pulled from Community Impact, which does go into a lot of the local community and things like that, and I like to think that some people read it since we get it for free and it's available online too. This quote here, that there's confusion about the floodplain maps, and that, getting at what I said, the FEMA map doesn't tell you for sure if you're going to be safe or not. It's just not what it was really originally intended for. It's just a statistical designation, and it's definitely not telling you based on the changes in these different areas, right? Anybody know where this is?
Oh, yeah.
Southwest side of Conroe. So I made a point during Hurricane Harvey. You see the model homes in the background, but much of them weren't built at this point. So I wanted to go out and get a picture of that community before they had put in things that would increase the runoff even further, with more roads, more homes, and things like that. And so you have this upstream, you have more homes up by Lake Conroe, all on the west side, right, of Conroe, that are adding more runoff to these areas that were already likely to get wet, well, just as is. I mean, this is what things look like right before all the building. So this is a home from River Plantation, right?
Doesn't exist anymore.
Right. But I wanted to make a point here in terms of last year when we looked at real estate values and how things compared and how people perceive risk and what this does to property values, right? So this, at the time, this is what the home was listed for, right?
Can't see it.
What is it,
The 204?
204?
304.
Yeah, sorry,
304?
yeah, about 305,000, right, if
Okay.
you round, okay? And there's a big reduction because it wasn't selling given risk and things like that. And probably other factors, again, you might know better than me. But this community, right, River Plantation, is older, right? People have a different perception of flood risk in this area, especially if they're from this area and they've heard about flooding and these different issues. Okay, now this home is older, right, when it was built, okay, but I want you to take note of the statistics. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, 2,600 square feet, okay? Here's the other home on the west side of the freeway. Similar flood risk, very close in terms of what the expected water level would be. Slightly different. This is right along the special flood hazards area. This is a little bit different, but pretty darn close. What's the price?
700?
$711,000, right? Okay, it's a little bigger, right? But 3 beds, 3.5 baths, it's not that different when you figure out the per square foot price. There's just a major difference. Sure, it's newer. That community hasn't been around as long. Didn't flood during Harvey because there were no
And
homes
nobody
there.
It wasn't even there.
And it's risk view is anthropocentric in nature, right? Oh, well, this home's okay. There's no disclosure that it flooded, right?
What happened during Burl? Did you look at it?
There wasn't as much flooding from Burl. It moved so quickly.
Or what was one in May?
yeah.
Was it-
Oh,
Yeah, that was a tropical storm.
Yeah.
Was that in Melda?
I don't know, I wasn't
No.
here.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't know. There wasn't much flooding in these areas. There could have been some neighborhoods that had flooding, but like in terms of these areas along the San Jacinto with like big river flooding, not as much was happening. So with that, I'm also gonna say that all I'm doing is showing you what the updated 100-year flood is, and that's as good as the data that we have at that time. Right? There's some that are advocating in engineering and geosciences and stuff that are saying, well, we don't really know for sure, right? If we do the statistics and whatever the confidence limit is in terms of considering error and stuff, we could have way more water in the river from some of these big events if we consider the different effects of these different things. And more water in the river than what we're already expecting, higher floods, right? When we do those boundaries and figure out how high the water is above these different levels. Now, going all the way to something that's maybe 50% higher than what we see with the 100-year flood with Harvey Incorporated, maybe not likely, but I worked with folks along the middle Mississippi and Illinois that were like, we better start planning for some of this with our levees, because they're already at risk in these rural areas and things like that. And if we don't plan now, we don't know what's gonna happen in 10, 20, 30 years, which is the planning horizon we need to look at, not just the next couple of years. So, just wrapping up, and so we can have some discussion, or if you guys have more questions about any of these, right? My point here is, I did this with undergraduate students relatively quickly. If we get the flood insurance boundaries and cross sections and things like that, we could get a better picture of risk in some of these areas more quickly. We don't have to wait 10 years to try to at least convey this to the community. You may have to wait to still get this published online and get it through the whole process. And ultimately, you still want to do hydraulic models with engineering firms and stuff like that, which is what the original flood insurance study is based on, right? So maybe geographers like me can help convey this and take existing engineering models and apply them in a better way to show people the risk isn't the same as what it used to be, okay? And part of the reason I'm talking with you all is I don't know the best way forward here. Like what conveys the risk the best to people? I was just talking again to some of my friends that
Probably
were
the bottom line.
real estate agents, and they're like, well, real estate agents don't have a
That's right.
direct interest in disclosing this to everybody.
No.
Once you get to the bank, yeah, and if you aren't in the floodplain, right, they want that box check to know if they're going to require it, because they don't want to take on the risk of the loss, right, if they lend the money. So new home buyers, homeowners that exist, they can only go by what's out there publicly.
Right.
That's the best we can do. And I always caution my class. I get upset with my class, my students, when they're like upset and angry that people live in the floodplain. And I'm like, you need to pull it back a second, because a lot of people may have moved there when they just didn't know, first of all. And second of all, once you're in a floodplain, I always ask my students, how many of you could just eat $250,000 and just go somewhere else? It's not that easy, right? You can't do that. I mean, unless you're gonna have voluntary buyouts that play the pre-market value and people are mobile enough to wanna relocate and move, that's just not how things work in terms of looking at things. Developers, I don't know how that would work, right? They're looking for land, they're looking to sell things. There's not a lot of regulation on this in Southeast Texas relative to other areas in the country, right? We're unfortunately consistently written about in different books, including law textbooks and things, about lack of zoning and regulation in this part of the world, okay? Cities and counties, maybe we can do things. You mentioned, for example, the city may say you can't build here or certain things, but oftentimes that kind of top-down regulation isn't always popular in communities. So can we work with communities and get out in the neighborhoods and just convey the risk better? I don't know for sure. So that's what I've got for you. Hopefully I've left at least 20 minutes to have a discussion before your meeting, if you all feel like doing that. This is my email if anybody ever feels like emailing me to ask any questions about different stuff we're doing. Our department does all kinds of different community-based stuff on different projects. We have it used to be Twitter, but it's X now. At SHSUGO is just all things our department usually posts, all the kinds of different stuff we're doing.
So have you thought about doing anything based on the release rate from the lake, how fast they open it and release it compared to
So
if it were a slow
I am
How long
release?
they wait before they release it too.
I am going to visit them again this week, and they have hydraulic engineering studies that have been done, and I've been trying to ask if I can get a hold of those models, because if they were built with the Army Corps of Engineers software, I do have experience using that. I did work on the Teaser River in Hungary, on the Illinois River. Our team worked on the Mississippi. So if I could get those models, I could run all kinds of different scenarios. But I haven't had so much luck yet. I mean, you could take the 100-year, or you could take the rating curve that we have and plug in what those releases are and get a water surface elevation. The one drawback is they have more updated data than I do in terms of the river cross sections and how they've changed after Harvey, because the geometry of the river has changed over the last several years too, right? So
Is that RP? Is that a picture of RP?
Sure looks like it.
it looks like RP. This is
No,
actually
not that one, the bottom one looks like RP to me. Yeah.
this is actually my development on the north side of Conroe where the flooding wasn't as bad. So this is in a development. I live on the northeast side, kind of over by the airport.
Okay.
And so I'm not showing you here, but yeah, our drainage filled all the way up, and it back flooded. There were three homes kind of over here, and even they flooded on the northeast side of town where the risk is lower overall.
For your flow rates,
Mhm.
were you using just data from the gauges? Or did you calculate anything versus runoff? I think I saw on your slide you didn't use any impervious cover increases.
I was not
Okay.
coupling hydrologic
Gotcha.
and hydraulic
Okay.
models. No, that would still be the gold standard for
Sure,
the
sure,
long
sure.
term.
Yeah,
I was just looking at
Real
the
world.
probability of what the gauge data was. So, and that's also the assumption. You're assuming you're at a 100-year flood at each of the gauges, which isn't always the case. You might be at an 80-year flood down here, a 40-year flood. I was assuming a 100-year flood all along, like they do with
I will,
FEMA.
I will say that one of the issues, and this is specific to Montgomery County, is their drainage design manual is from 1989.
Yeah.
They have been saying they were gonna update it for the past 4 or 5 years. And, you know, regulations or not, obviously needs to be changed. Harris County's done a little bit better job, and so you've seen a little bit of the reduction, and they are harping very heavily on detention and mitigation. They treat now the 500-year floodplain like the 100-year until the new maps come out. So there are.
That's been more common across the
Yeah,
country.
yeah.
They're just
You know,
assuming
I
the
mean,
500-year boundary is the 100.
You can say what you want about developers, but they really are being taxed the buck.
Yep.
Now, it's more speculative than it is actual research based, I would say. It's just kind of like we need to do something, but there are things that are making it. But there's another problem that Harris County specifically is running out of developable land.
Right.
And so people are using the crap land now.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is okay because it's being coupled with this very stringent regulation of the 500-year floodplain. And
Right.
But I mean,
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard because
all to your point, you can detain till you're blue in the face.
Yeah.
You're never going to do it right enough to slow down the floods.
no, and I mean, so this was engineered well for most floods in our development. The problem is now you can build a lot of things on the front end. There's not always the money and budget for the maintenance of these types of things. So what happened in our drainage is this was filling up with sediment, so the capacity is not what it used to be. These get blocked with vegetation and plastic sometimes during storms, and the water backs up. And so what's actually happening is at the end of the streets in our development, they're getting a lot of back pressure from the stormwater sewers that feed directly into this. And the end of the street's not technically in the floodplain. It's not river flooding. It's backed up flooding from the detention.
And
basin.
that's another issue is the length of these rainstorms are increasing.
Yeah.
And as you saw from the slide, 100 and 500 are typically based off precipitation over a 24-hour period.
Yep.
Well, if you get half of that, but at a consistent rate for 36 hours, or in Harvey's potential, it's not necessarily that you couldn't handle an intense rainstorm, it's that you couldn't handle the actual amount of water that fell.
Yeah.
Which is a newer thing that we're having to look at in the development side of things, is the amount of water, not how fast it falls.
Yeah.
Because if you got, I would be willing to bet that if you just got a typical 100-year rainstorm, 12 inches in 24 hours, you'd handle it fine.
Yep.
It's
Yeah.
12 inches in 25 hours that all of a sudden becomes a brand new
Yeah.
equation.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just accumulating too much.
Yeah. So one thing they've done is we actually did, using LiDAR, we did a basic drainage model of the entire district.
Yeah.
Because their issue is they have flooding coming back. They're kind of what I call a first flush district.
Yeah.
So, historically don't have detention, so they've talked about on the lots that have been condemned or things that have been purchased, putting kind of pocket storage. You gotta find a place for the water to go. If you can put it in a hole, that connects to the drainage system. It's not gonna save everybody, but it could save one or two homes for relatively.
So when you guys did your drainage study, did you look at water surface elevations too then of what's happening?
Yes.
And then what was the ultimate level that it was draining to? Were you assuming that it was going down to the existing 100-year, or was it a 500-year?
We assumed 100-year. We did a couple different things. So we just assumed like 100-year outfall. What does it look like?
Okay.
Which is tricky in this area because of the backup, and then we assumed kind of a first flush.
Yeah.
Because our main goal was to say, what is the localized flooding? Meaning that if it just rained here for an extended period of time, are you flooding anybody first and foremost?
Yeah.
And then you start looking at what does the outfall procedure look like, so that you can start to say, okay, it's still raining, the river's full, now where are you flooding? And
Yeah.
that changes the whole dynamic of the
So it's
equation.
so you're kind of looking at pluvial flooding first,
Correct,
and then pluvial with riverine type.
Because you can fix
Yeah.
the first flush flooding. If
Right.
you've got bad storm sewers and things like that, and you're overwhelming the system, you just upsize pipes, get it out faster.
Right. Right.
Fixing the second stage is
The second part,
is
yeah.
the tricky
The
part.
second part you don't control
Yeah,
as
yeah.
much with their river stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta find a place for the water to go at that point. You can't
Yeah.
do anything about your system.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Any other questions?
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good information, yeah.
interesting.
Hopefully it's interesting in
But-
some way.
But I don't know if you know this neighborhood, the most important thing for us here is the release of the dam.
Yeah, and that's
We,
yeah.
On an observational
Harvey's a
data
whole-
level, like these guys are
yeah,
pros at it. They know exactly what the release rate is gonna cause, what here.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting. That would be.
Yeah, and if we wanted to look at that, I could get a team of students together. I always have students that are interested in undergraduate research projects. I could take different scenario data of what the flow rate was from the dam, and we could generate the same types of maps.
Harvey's a different deal altogether, but we get flooded here too many times just because of the flow coming from the.
Essentially, what they end up doing is overwhelming the
Yeah.
river system by releasing too much water. It's the same as having too
Maybe
small.
at
of a
one
pipe.
time, they wait till the last
Yeah,
minute.
they wait till the last
Yeah.
minute to open it.
Well, and the question with the dam is, well, this is a problem with dams all over
Right.
Texas, by the way. It's very different than different places I've lived, because the dams in Texas, they're not like the dams on the Colorado River, like my time in the Southwest, that can store any excess water that comes in, right? I mean, they're trying to keep all the drinking water in there for times like 2011, 12.
It's
and
a surface water.
yeah, and you can lower it a couple feet, but when you get it becomes a quantity problem, right? I mean, if you're dropping 12 inches of rain, there's just nowhere for that to all be stored in these small. Like Lake Conroe's not as big a reservoir.
I think the issue, and it's a political issue, is a rainstorm's coming.
Yeah.
You drop the lake 5 feet, and that rainstorm only gives you 3 feet back.
Right.
And then the residents on the lake, boat docks are too far out of the
Yeah.
water. I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy to think about, but like that's as kind of as simplistic as you can put
Well,
it.
yeah, you get that, and then what if on top of that, following that storm, and like if it's a
You have a
spring
drought.
storm, you have a 2011-12 drought. You
Correct.
drop the lake 5 feet. The storm misses us. Then you have a 2011-12 drought. I mean, to me, the river authority is they're kind of in a no-win situation. I mean, they could maybe start releasing a little bit.
The
earlier
difference is
sometimes,
they
but
need-
I don't have all the, like I said, I don't have access to all of their.
The difference is
engineering
that if you look at the release rate, once the rainstorm hits, they need to have a set point in which they're releasing water
Yeah.
faster than it's coming in. They're just,
Yeah.
they're not, I mean, it sounds like they're doing some studies. I'd love for them to release them to be peer reviewed, because it would be very interesting to see what they're calculating coming into the river versus going out in a 100-year rainstorm.
Right.
Because at that point, then you can set a fixed rate to say, you guys flood at 60 CFS, let's set it at 45 CFS and get water the hell out of here.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to see their models for things other than Harvey. I mean, Harvey was such a catastrophic
Right.
event. Like,
Yeah.
It's hard to
You
quantify that,
can't
you
fix
know.
Harvey.
no, I mean, I think I have seen that data at some point, and I want to say the inflows then were like 50,000 CFS,
Right.
more than what they were releasing, and they couldn't really release more
Yeah.
for safety of the dam and stuff.
Yeah, they couldn't open it anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so when you're looking at something like that, but for some of these smaller events, I haven't
Right.
seen all the models to look at what their input is, and yeah, this is a problem just with academia versus industry versus governmental stuff. It's like we're lamenting all the time. It'd be nice to see all the data that's out there when we do this, so that we know like. I mean, I could look at all this stuff that like based on the river authority, but they probably have it all for what they paid the other engineering company, I'm sure. And then what gets released to the public versus not? Like most of this, at least to my understanding, I don't know if we have the lawyers on the call or not, but I would think the river authorities are subject to the same open records request that other
I mean, I know
governmental agencies are.
I know because
right?
they're updating their drainage thing, they're doing a ton of modeling, and I want to say the engineering firms that's doing a lot of
Yeah.
it. I know specifically in precinct 4, but I think they're
Yeah.
doing it countywide.
Yeah.
So
I'm supposed to take my class there. I forget if it's this Wednesday or next Wednesday, but I will ask again.
Yes.
And if you guys want to stay in touch, yeah, we could look at all different releases. Cause like, hold on, if I just go back, just turn it off. So let me look.
I just find.
So
it
this,
amazing
yeah,
how-
these rates I'm looking at here, if you notice these flow rates, I mean, I think they were releasing over 200,000 CFS from
What
there.
is that
So
column?
that rated.
What is that column telling me?
This column is when we ran the stats with HEC SSP for the engineering software from Army Corps. This is looking at the expected discharge once Harvey was incorporated in the record for what a 100-year flood would be expected to have. And so this is how much it increased between
Okay,
before Harvey.
Move over a couple of columns.
Mhm.
What's the 100-year?
This is the water surface elevation. So that's how you're
So
deriving the flood
158
map.
feet?
Yeah, so this is, well, the water surface elevation is 158 feet above sea level, above the datum for sea level.
And that's in Lake Conroe.
Just
Y'all-
downstream of Lake Conroe, yeah.
Y'all are sitting.
Oh,
This
ours
is
would be
right here.
124. Okay.
Yeah,
that's-
so
okay.
after you're expecting the water surface elevation to be about 126.6.
So
for
my house
100
is
year
at
flood.
128,
Yeah,
so I'd be okay.
based on the statistics from
I understand.
2017, 18, maybe.
Yeah.
We'd have to add 6 more years
Well, I've
of
never
data to see.
flooded, so luckily. But,
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's right.
But yeah, we could look at Harvey and these release events and see, and maybe at 128 you're okay, because there is still some land around here where the water can spread out a ways when it gets out of its banks. Sometimes it doesn't get much higher than that. I mean, sometimes you reach a plateau and you have a lot of water, but it's expanding but not getting a lot higher at that point. It just depends on what the geometry is of the floodplain and the river.
So these studies you could do, is there any way you guys could give us some ideas of what we might could do to help this subdivision?
I mean, my focus is more on the riverine part, so these guys that do the engineering studies with the pluvial and drainage stuff, they're the experts at that kind of thing. I mean, like I said, if you all were interested in having me look at some of these different scenarios where I could give you water surface elevations that might be helpful based on these different things we've looked at, I'm happy to see. It might not be the fastest thing in the world, because we don't have grad students in our department, and so, and I teach a bigger load than most research universities, but, hi.
Hello,
But if you guys have ideas that you want us to look at, I could tell you if they're feasible or not, and like I said, I've usually got some pretty solid junior and senior level students that are looking for projects from time to time, so,
Okay.
yeah.